down by 6.
Long rebound to Green.
Loops it to Bird, a runner.
He's a beast, truly. That is the only way to describe Michael Jordan, and Terry Cummings knew that better than almost anyone who ever stepped onto a basketball court. But here is something most fans have forgotten over the years. Back in 1985, during Jordan's very first trip to the playoffs, Terry Cummings did something that no other player in the history of the league has ever done. He outscored Michael Jordan across an entire playoff series. Cummings averaged 29, 5 points a game. Jordan averaged 29, 3. That is not a typo, and it is truly not a trick of memory. That really happened, right there, in front of real fans, on a real court, when the pressure was at its highest. Think about that for a moment. Jordan would go on to become the most feared scorer the game has ever seen. He would torch nearly every defender who ever tried to slow him down, in city after city for close to 2 decades. Yet in that very first series, in that very first taste of playoff basketball, it was Terry Cummings who stood across from him and matched him shot for shot, and came out ahead on the scoreboard when the series was finished. That does not mean Cummings was somehow a better all-around player than Jordan. Nobody watching that series, and nobody looking back on it now, would make that claim. What it does mean is that Cummings was a serious elite-level scorer in his own right, a tough and physical forward who refused to be pushed around, and a man who was about to spend the next several years of his career facing some of the toughest and most talented opponents the sport of basketball has ever produced. And if stories like this deserve more attention, right now is the moment to use the hype feature and give this video some hype. Players like Terry Cummings do not get talked about nearly enough these days, even though their careers are filled with battles just like this one. Every bit of hype helps keep stories like his alive, and it helps new fans discover just how tough this era of basketball really was. It only takes a second, and it makes a real difference for stories that might otherwise be forgotten. Think about what it takes for a name to stay attached to a moment like that Jordan series for so many decades. Thousands of players have stepped onto an NBA court since that year of 1985. Thousands of them have faced Michael Jordan at some point across his long and dominant career. Yet only one name keeps coming up whenever people talk about the rare occasions when Jordan did not walk away with the higher scoring average. That name is Terry Cummings. That is not luck. That is not a fluke of scheduling or a soft matchup. That is the result of a player who showed up ready to compete against one of the greatest talents the sport had ever seen. Right at the very moment that talent was beginning to reveal itself to the world, in front of everyone watching. So why does a list like this matter so much? Because Terry Cummings did not play his career during an easy stretch of NBA history. He played through the 1980s and into the early 1990s, right in the middle of one of the deepest, most talented, and most physically demanding eras the league has ever seen. This was a time filled with relentless scorers, brilliant passers, powerful rebounders, and defenders who could shut down an entire offense almost by themselves. Night after night, season after season, Cummings had to prepare for a different kind of nightmare matchup. Michael Jordan was quickly becoming an unstoppable scoring machine. The kind of player who could take over a game in the blink of an eye. Larry Bird was proving again and again that pure skill and pure basketball intelligence could beat almost any opponent placed in front of him. Julius Erving was still playing with the grace, the polish, and the championship pedigree that had already made him one of the most respected legends the sport had ever seen. Charles Barkley was turning into one of the most physically dominant power forwards the league had ever produced. A player built like a wall who moved like a much smaller man. Karl Malone was building himself year by year into a strong, punishing scorer who could beat you in the paint or from the mid-range with equal ease. And even beyond these 5 men, Cummings still had to deal with Hakeem Olajuwon guarding the rim with terrifying instincts, Magic Johnson controlling entire games with his vision and his passing, and Dominique Wilkins attacking the basket with pure, explosive athleticism that made highlight reels all on its own. Put all of that together and you begin to understand exactly why Terry Cummings, looking back on his long career, picked out 5 matchups that stood above all the rest. These were not simply famous names picked because they sounded good on a list. These were the players who made every single possession feel like a genuine fight. Every game against them became a lesson in survival, a test of both body and mind. When Cummings talks about his toughest matchups, he is not casually naming stars he happened to share a court with. He is naming the specific players who tested his strength, his focus, and his sheer will to compete, night after night, series after series, for nearly 2 decades of professional basketball. It also helps to remember that Cummings was not a role player standing quietly in the corner of the floor. He was a focal point of his own team's offense, a player who was expected to score, to rebound, and to lead by example on both ends of the court. That meant every one of these matchups was a two-way street. He was not just trying to slow down some of the greatest players in league history. He was also trying to outscore them, outwork them, and outlast them over the full course of an entire game, and often over the course of an entire playoff series. Facing that kind of double demand, defending a legend while also being relied upon to produce offense of his own, made every single one of these matchups even harder than they already were on paper. That is the real weight behind this list. It is not simply a collection of great opponents. It is a picture of what it actually took to survive and to thrive during one of the most stacked and unforgiving stretches of talent the NBA has ever produced. It also says something about how Cummings viewed his own career. Plenty of players, when looking back, prefer to focus only on their own achievements, their own scoring totals, and their own personal highlights. Cummings instead chose to reflect on the players who challenged him the most. That choice says a great deal about his character. It shows a player who valued genuine competition over easy praise, and who understood that the true measure of a career is not just what you accomplished, but who you had to overcome to accomplish it. That mindset is exactly what makes this list of toughest matchups feel so honest, so grounded, and so genuinely worth telling to a new generation of fans. Let us start with the man from that unforgettable 1985 playoff series, Michael Jordan. For Cummings, this matchup stood far above almost every other challenge in his long career, and it is easy to see exactly why. That 1985 playoff series would already have been remarkable on its own. Outscoring any rookie in the postseason is a real accomplishment. But Jordan was not just any rookie stepping onto the floor for the first time. Within just a few short years, he became one of the single most unstoppable scorers professional basketball has ever produced. Defenders across the entire league, no matter how strong, how fast, or how experienced, struggled to find any real answer for him. He could shoot from the outside with ease, attack the rim with pure force, and finish through heavy contact in ways that left even the most seasoned defenders looking completely lost on the floor. The research points to this being one of the toughest tests Cummings faced, and he faced it again and again throughout the rest of his career. Whenever Milwaukee, and later San Antonio, matched up against Chicago, Cummings knew exactly what was coming his way. He knew he would have to deal with Jordan's relentless scoring for an entire night, from the opening tip to the final buzzer. There was no easy possession against a player like that. There was no moment to relax, no moment to catch your breath. Jordan attacked constantly, wave after wave, and he attacked with a level of focus and determination that very few players in the history of the sport have ever come close to matching. What makes this matchup so impressive for Cummings is not simply that early series win, as remarkable as it was. It is the fact that he kept showing up against Jordan year after year, long after Jordan had transformed into the single most feared player in all of basketball. Most players who face a legend like that a handful of times come away with story after story of struggle, frustration, and difficulty. Cummings certainly has plenty of stories like that too. Stories of long nights trying to slow down a player who could not truly be slowed. But he also has that early moment back in 1985, when he stood toe-to-toe with a rising legend in the very beginning of that legend's story, and matched him basket for basket across an entire series. That single fact tells you almost everything you need to know about how serious a competitor Terry Cummings really was. He did not back down from greatness when it appeared in front of him. He did not shrink from the moment, and he did not let the pressure of the postseason change the way he approached the game. He met that greatness head-on, right from the very beginning of Jordan's career, and he held his ground. Years later, when fans look back at Jordan's long list of playoff opponents, they see name after name of players who were simply overwhelmed. Terry Cummings is the one name that stands apart from that pattern, and that alone should tell you everything about the kind of fighter he was on the basketball court. It is worth pausing here to think about what that early series must have felt like from the inside. Jordan was already showing flashes of the player he would soon become, attacking the basket with speed and confidence that made older, more experienced defenders look unsure of themselves. Most players across the league were still trying to figure out exactly how to guard him. There was no scouting report built from years of history to lean on, because nobody had ever truly seen a talent quite like this one before. Cummings had to solve that puzzle on the fly, in real time, with a playoff series on the line, and he did it while also carrying his own scoring load for his team. That is part of what makes this matchup so central to any conversation about Cummings' toughest tests. It was not simply about defending a great player. It was about competing against a player who was actively redefining what the league thought was possible, and doing so with poise, and doing so while still producing at an elite level himself. Few players in NBA history can say they matched a young Michael Jordan basket for basket in the postseason. Terry Cummings can say exactly that, and it remains one of the most remarkable accomplishments quietly sitting inside his long and varied career. As the years passed and Jordan's game continued to grow sharper, faster, and more complete, the challenge of facing him only grew heavier. Cummings kept returning to that challenge whenever his team crossed paths with Chicago, fully aware of what he was walking into each time. That kind of repeated exposure to a player at that level, without ever fully turning away from the challenge, is exactly the mark of a competitor who belongs at the very top of any list of toughest matchups. There's a certain kind of respect that only comes from facing an opponent again and again across many seasons. It is one thing to have a single great performance against a rising star. It is another thing entirely to keep stepping onto the floor against that same player for years long. After the element of surprise has worn off, long after every defense in the league has already tried and failed to find a real answer, Cummings did exactly that, matchup after matchup, season after season. And he never stopped competing at full effort, even as Jordan's legend continued to grow larger and larger with every single passing year. That is what makes the next name on this list so important. Because facing Michael Jordan was only the beginning of a long and brutal run of difficult matchups for Terry Cummings. Larry Bird. Bird and the Boston Celtics stood as one of the biggest roadblocks for Milwaukee throughout Cummings' prime years with the Bucks. This was not a matchup built on pure physical power, the way some battles in the league were. This was a matchup built almost entirely on pure basketball intelligence, on skill, and on years of refined technique. Bird's shooting was elite from every single level of the court. Whether he was standing in the corner, at the top of the key, or fading away with a hand right in his face, his passing could carve apart a defense in a single motion, finding gaps that other players never even noticed were there. His understanding of the game, his feel for angles, spacing, and timing, made him one of the smartest players to ever step onto an NBA floor. Every single time Cummings and the Bucks squared off against Bird and the Celtics, the game turned into a real, hard-fought battle from the very first possession. It is easy to see why facing Bird would belong on Cummings' list of toughest matchups. Bird was not the kind of player you could simply stop with brute strength alone, no matter how strong or physical you were. He forced opponents to think just as hard as they competed physically. A defender could do everything right on a given possession, get into perfect position, contest the shot exactly the way they were taught, and still watch Bird calmly rise up and knock down a shot from an almost impossible angle. Or he might quietly find an open teammate through a gap in the defense that seemed to appear out of nowhere at the last possible second. For a physical, hard-nosed player like Cummings, that kind of intelligence and unpredictability presented a completely different kind of challenge than raw strength or raw speed ever could. This matchup also reveals something important about the kind of competitor Cummings truly was. Facing Bird meant staying locked in for every single possession of every single game, because Bird never gave an opponent a moment to switch off. One small lapse in focus, and Bird would make you pay for it in front of a packed arena. Cummings had to bring real discipline and sharp awareness on top of his natural physical tools. Night after night, series after series, against one of the smartest and most complete players the sport of basketball has ever produced. That combination of physical toughness and mental discipline is exactly what made Cummings such a respected competitor across the entire league during his career. There is also something worth noting about the setting of these matchups. Milwaukee and Boston were two of the most competitive franchises in the Eastern Conference during this stretch, and their games carried real weight in the standings almost every single time they met. That meant Cummings was not just facing Bird in a quiet, low-pressure regular season game that nobody would remember. He was facing him in games that mattered, in front of crowds that expected a real fight, with playoff positioning often hanging in the balance. That kind of added pressure adds an extra real layer of difficulty to an already demanding matchup, because there is simply no room at all to have an off night. What made Bird such a uniquely difficult opponent was the fact that he could beat a defender in more than one way on the very same possession. A defender might successfully take away his three-point shot, only to watch him drive baseline and finish with a soft touch around the rim. A defender might crowd him on the drive, only to watch him calmly kick the ball out to an open shooter before the defense could recover. Cummings had to account for all of those possibilities at once every single time Bird touched the ball, which is exactly the kind of relentless mental strain that turns a tough matchup into one of the toughest matchups of an entire career. Facing that kind of unpredictability night after night takes a real toll on a defender, even one as tough and experienced as Cummings. There is no single defensive scheme that solves a player who can beat you with a pass just as easily as he can beat you with a jump shot. That constant uncertainty, that need to be ready for absolutely anything on every single possession, is precisely why so many players across the entire league considered Bird one of the single hardest matchups they ever had to prepare for. And Cummings was certainly no exception to that rule at all. Then came a different kind of test entirely. One that took Cummings all the way back to the very start of his professional journey: Julius Erving. Early in Cummings' career, Julius Erving and the Philadelphia 76ers stood as one of the most dominant teams in the entire NBA. At that stage of his life, Cummings was still a young forward just beginning to establish himself at the highest level of professional basketball, still learning what it truly took to compete night after night against grown men who had already proven themselves on the biggest stages the sport had to offer. Standing across from him on so many of those early nights was a legend who already carried championship experience, incredible natural athleticism, and a level of poise that only comes from years spent at the very top of the sport. The research points to this matchup being about far more than just physical difficulty alone. Yes, Dr. J's athleticism presented a serious challenge on its own, the kind that could embarrass a defender who was not fully ready for it. But the real test for Cummings was proving, possession after possession, that he genuinely belonged on the same floor as a champion of that stature. Every single trip up and down the court against Erving was also a test of composure and nerve. It would have been easy for a young, unproven player to feel completely overwhelmed standing across from someone with that kind of reputation and that kind of experience. Instead, Cummings competed. He absorbed the lessons that came from facing a legend so early in his career, and he carried those lessons forward, using them to grow into the player he would soon become for the rest of the decade. It is easy to see why this battle would belong near the top of Cummings' list of toughest matchups. Facing Erving was never just about defending a great scorer for 48 minutes. It was about proving over and over again, night after night, that a young forward out of DePaul could genuinely hold his own against one of the most respected champions the league had ever produced. That kind of test, faced early and faced repeatedly, helped shape Cummings into the tough, poised, and confident competitor he would become for the rest of his long career. This matchup was never really about speed, and it was not only about experience either. Facing Erving forced Cummings to grow up quickly, on the court and off it. And that growth would pay enormous dividends in every single matchup that was still to come in his career. Consider the position Cummings was in during those early seasons. He had just arrived in the league, carrying the weight of huge expectations after a dominant college career. Now he was expected to step directly onto the floor against a team built around a champion who had already won at the very highest level. There was no gentle, easy introduction to professional basketball waiting for him at all. There was only Julius Erving, standing on the other side of the court, ready to test whether the young forward truly had what it took to compete at this level. What stands out most about this early chapter of Cummings' career is that he did not shrink away from the challenge, even when it would have been completely understandable to feel a little overwhelmed. He kept competing, kept learning, and kept building the kind of toughness that would define the rest of his time in the league. Facing a champion so early, and facing him repeatedly, gave Cummings a foundation that many young players never get the chance to build. It taught him what real competition at the highest level actually looked like, long before he had fully settled into his own game. Many young players entering the league during this era were given time to develop against softer competition before being thrown into matchups with genuine champions. Cummings did not have that luxury, and in many ways, that lack of a gentle introduction turned out to be a hidden gift. It forced him to mature quickly, to sharpen his instincts, and to build the kind of lasting resilience that would serve him well for the rest of his long and demanding career in the league. Charles Barkley. By the late 1980s, Charles Barkley had fully emerged into superstardom, and he brought a completely different kind of physical challenge to every single game he played. Barkley became one of the most physically dominant power forwards the league has ever produced, a player who seemed to defy the normal rules of size and strength, His raw power alone made him a serious handful for any defender in the league. Add in his relentless rebounding instincts and his constant grinding pressure around the basket, and you get one of the most punishing and exhausting matchups in the entire NBA during that era of basketball. The research is clear that these battles between Cummings and Barkley created some of the toughest tests of Cummings' entire career. Barkley did not rely on finesse or clever trickery to beat his opponents. He simply kept coming, possession after possession, using his strength to bully his way into position, and using his rebounding instincts to control the glass at both ends of the floor. For Cummings, that meant there was no way to coast through even a single quarter of a game against Barkley. Every single trip down the floor required full effort and full focus, because Barkley was always ready to punish even the smallest lapse in concentration or positioning. It is easy to see why this matchup earned such a firm place on Cummings' list of toughest opponents. Standing across from Barkley and holding your ground, night after night, series after series, says a great deal about a player's own strength, discipline, and toughness. This was never a matchup for a player who shied away from physical contact or who wilted under constant pressure. Cummings met Barkley's power with power of his own, refusing to be moved off his spot. And that willingness to battle in the trenches against one of the strongest and most explosive forwards in league history speaks directly to the kind of competitor Cummings truly was throughout his entire career. Part of what made Barkley so uniquely difficult was the sheer contrast between his size and his athleticism. On paper alone, his height might have suggested a real mismatch in Cummings' favor. In reality, Barkley's combination of strength, leaping ability, and sheer determination erased that expectation almost immediately. Cummings could not simply rely on his own frame to control the matchup. He had to match effort with effort, fight with fight, on every single rebound and every single post-up, fully aware that Barkley was going to bring that same intensity for all 48 minutes of the game. These battles also carried real stakes beyond individual pride. Both players were focal points for their teams, which meant every possession in this matchup often had a direct impact on the final score. Winning the physical battle against Barkley was not just a personal accomplishment. It was often a necessary condition for Cummings' own team to have any real chance of winning the game. That kind of added weight turns a difficult individual matchup into one that carries pressure for an entire roster, and that pressure is exactly what made these confrontations so memorable and so demanding. Very few forwards in league history were built quite like Barkley, and that rarity made him almost impossible to fully prepare for. Cummings could study film, plan his positioning, and brace for contact, yet Barkley still found ways to surprise him, whether through a sudden explosive burst toward the rim or a difficult rebound ripped away from a taller defender, through sheer determination alone. By the time Cummings reached the Western Conference later in his playing days, the battles did not get any easier at all. In fact, one more punishing rivalry was already waiting for him out there: Karl Malone. When Cummings moved west to join the San Antonio Spurs, Karl Malone quickly became one of his biggest and most consistent rivals. Their matchups were bruising, physical battles between two elite power forwards who built their entire games on strength, positioning, and mid-range scoring. This was never a flashy matchup filled with highlight reel plays or acrobatic finishes. It was a grinding physical contest fought possession by possession, shoulder to shoulder, in the toughest and most demanding area of the basketball court. The research points to this rivalry as one of the clearest and most direct power forward battles that Cummings ever experienced during his long career. Both men relied heavily on strength to create the space they needed to score. Both men trusted their mid-range jump shot to punish any defender who dared to give them even a small amount of room to operate. There was no easy way through a matchup like that one. It came down to who wanted it more on any given night, who could hold their position longer without giving an inch, and who could knock down the tougher shot when the game was on the line. For Cummings, this matchup stands as the perfect final example of just how difficult his career path truly was from start to finish. He spent years fighting through matchups against Jordan, Bird, Irving, and Barkley in the Eastern Conference. Then, instead of finally catching a break, he moved west and immediately ran straight into one of the strongest and most determined power forwards in the entire league. That is not the career path of a player who ever had it easy. That is the career path of a true competitor who kept proving himself, year after year, against a constantly shifting list of elite and demanding opponents. Cummings' battles with Malone were never really about flash or highlight reels. They were about strength, spacing, tough shots, and pure pride. Two proud, powerful forwards, refusing to give an inch to one another night after night, season after season. That is exactly the kind of matchup that belongs at the very heart of any honest list about toughness in the NBA. There is also something fitting about the timing of this rivalry within Cummings' career. By the time he was facing Malone on a regular basis, Cummings was no longer the young forward trying to prove he belonged. He was an experienced, battle-tested veteran who had already survived years of difficult matchups against some of the toughest competition the Eastern Conference had to offer. Facing Malone at this stage of his career meant relying on every lesson he had learned along the way, from the footwork he had sharpened against Bird to the physical toughness he had developed against Barkley, to the poise he had first built against Irving all those years earlier. In many ways, the Malone matchup pulled together everything Cummings had learned from every difficult opponent that came before it. It demanded strength, it demanded intelligence, and it demanded a refusal to back down, all at the exact same time. Few rivalries capture the full picture of what it took to compete at Cummings' position during this era, quite as clearly as the ongoing battles between these two proud elite power forwards, each one refusing to hand the other a single easy possession across the entire game. Those five men represent the true core of Cummings' toughest matchups. But they were far from the only difficult opponents he faced throughout his long and demanding career on the court. Hakeem Olajuwon made every single trip into the paint against Houston, an enormous challenge for Cummings, and for nearly every other forward in the league. Few defenders in the history of the sport combined shot blocking, footwork, and pure defensive instinct the way Olajuwon did during his prime years. And attacking his interior defense required real courage, real precision, and a great deal of confidence. Magic Johnson made life difficult for opponents in an entirely different way. His ability to control the pace of an entire game through transition offense and truly elite passing constantly forced opponents, including Cummings, to defend in uncomfortable, fast-moving situations that never allowed for a single moment of rest or recovery. And then there was Dominique Wilkins, whose explosive athleticism created difficult defensive assignments for almost every forward in the league throughout that entire era. His many matchups with Cummings added even more depth to an already demanding list of tough opponents, further proving just how loaded and unforgiving this stretch of NBA history truly was for everyone involved. These three names alone show just how brutal the overall competition was during Cummings' long career. When a player's honorable mentions include a defensive anchor as feared as Olajuwon, a pace-controlling legend as brilliant as Magic Johnson, and an explosive, high-flying scorer like Dominique Wilkins, it becomes even clearer just how impressive it truly is that five other names managed to stand out as the very toughest matchups of them all. Think about what it means for a player's career when names of that caliber only make the honorable mentions list. In many other eras of NBA history, a single matchup against a player like Olajuwon or Magic Johnson might be the defining rivalry of an entire career. For Cummings, these towering names were simply part of the wider landscape he had to navigate on his way toward the five matchups that stood above everything else. That context alone should reshape how fans think about the depth and difficulty of the competition Cummings faced across nearly 2 decades in the league, a stretch of basketball history that may never be matched again for sheer talent and physical demand. Terry Cummings' list of toughest matchups is not only a story about how great Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, Julius Irving, Charles Barkley, and Karl Malone were during their remarkable careers. It is just as much a story about how strong, how focused, and how resilient Terry Cummings had to be to face that kind of relentless competition over and over again, year after year, without ever once backing down from the challenge in front of him. He did not simply witness one of the greatest eras in basketball history from a safe distance, watching from the sidelines as legends built their legacies. He stood directly in the middle of it, matchup after matchup, absorbing every single challenge those legends could possibly throw at him, and finding a way to compete regardless of who was standing across from him. Terry Cummings' toughest matchups remind us of something truly important about his career and his character. He was not just watching greatness unfold from close range, admiring it the way a fan might. He was fighting against it directly and repeatedly, night after night, and holding his own the entire time. That is a legacy truly worth remembering, and it is a legacy that deserves real, lasting respect from every single fan of the game. It is easy, decades later, to remember the biggest names from this era, and forget the players who competed against them possession after possession, year after year. History tends to focus on the men who won the most championships or scored the most points, and rightfully so. But a full picture of that era also has to include the players who made every one of those legends work for what they achieved. Terry Cummings was exactly that kind of player. He was not a bystander in one of the greatest stretches of basketball talent the sport has ever seen. He was an active participant in it, a player whose name belongs in the same conversation as the legends he battled against. When you line up Jordan, Bird, Irving, Barkley, and Malone side by side, you're looking at 5 players who, between them, reshaped what the game of basketball could look like. Different eras, different strengths, different playing styles entirely. Yet Terry Cummings found a real way to compete against every single one of them, adapting his game to whatever challenge stood in front of him on a given night. That kind of adaptability, paired with that kind of physical and mental toughness, is exactly why his toughest matchups deserve to be remembered as more than a simple list of famous names. So the next time someone brings up the greatest rivalries and matchups of the 1980s and early 1990s, remember the forward who outscored a young Michael Jordan in the postseason, who matched wits with Larry Bird, who tested himself against Julius Erving's championship pedigree, who traded blows in the post with Charles Barkley, and who battled Karl Malone possession after possession out west. Remember Terry Cummings, a player who never once backed down from the very best the league had to offer, and who proved, time after time, that he truly deserved his place among them.